of the moms called me just a dropout babysitter who probably can't even do her own laundry. When I tried to help her choking daughter, she screamed, "Get this dropout off my baby." I didn't say a word. That was 3 weeks ago. Yesterday, she asked if I'd consider being their full-time nanny and started crying when I said no. Parents at a playdate mocked me for being just a babysitter until one of their kids started choking. I'd been babysitting for the Miller family for 2 years when Mrs. Miller asked me to bring her 4-year-old son to a playdate at her friend's house while she was at work. At 19, with tattoos covering my arms and purple streaks in my hair, I looked exactly like what these suburban moms feared most when they thought about who was watching their precious children. But actually, I'd been a certified paramedic for 3 years and had already saved more lives than most people would in their entire lifetime. The host mom, Grace, took one look at me when I walked in with little Jackson and immediately pulled Mrs. Miller's son away from me like I might be contagious. "So you're the babysitter," she said slowly, like I might not understand basic English. "We usually only allow parents or relatives at these playdates, but I suppose we can make an exception just this once." She turned to the other moms and announced loudly that everyone should keep an extra close eye on their children today since we have a situation where proper supervision might be lacking. Another mom approached me while I was helping Jackson take off his shoes and asked if I was still in high school. When I said no, she exchanged knowing looks with Grace and said, "Oh, so you dropped out then? That explains why you're doing this instead of going to college like normal girls your age." Before I could respond, she was already telling the others about the epidemic of teenage dropouts who think raising other people's children is a career path. Grace started questioning me about my credentials while using air quotes around the word. She wanted to know if I'd ever taken a child development class, if I knew CPR, if I understood basic nutrition. When I tried to answer, she cut me off and told the other moms that this was why she always insisted on meeting caregivers first. "You never know what kind of person is being trusted with innocent children these days," she said while staring at my tattoos. "Some people think anyone with a pulse can watch kids." They made me sit in the corner of the living room while the children played, treating me like hired help who shouldn't mingle with the real adults. One mom loudly discussed how her nanny had a degree in early childhood education from Harvard while looking directly at me. "That's the difference between a professional and someone who just needs quick cash," she said. "We invest in people who see childcare as a calling, not teenagers who probably spend the whole time on their phones while the TV babysits." Grace brought out organic snacks for the children and made a point of asking if I even knew what organic meant. When I stayed quiet, she explained to her friends that these types usually fed kids processed junk because they didn't understand the importance of proper nutrition. "She probably gives Jackson McDonald's every day and calls it dinner," she said while I helped the kids open their juice boxes. "This is what happens when overwhelmed parents get desperate and hire the first warm body who responds to their ad." They started discussing how much they paid their nannies, making sure I could hear every word about their extensive background checks and reference requirements. One mentioned she'd never hire someone under 25 because teenagers lacked the maturity and life experience to handle emergencies. "Can you imagine trusting someone who probably can't even do their own laundry with your child's life?" she asked while they all laughed. "These girls think babysitting is just easy money until something goes wrong and they panic." Grace decided to test me by asking what I'd do if a child had an allergic reaction. Before I could answer, she was already telling everyone that I probably didn't even know what an EpiPen was. "This is the problem with informal childcare arrangements," she lectured. "No training, no education, just teenagers who think watching their younger siblings makes them qualified to care for other people's children." The latecomer's daughter started coughing while eating grapes, and her mother laughed it off, saying kids always made dramatic noises for attention. The coughing got worse, but she just told her to drink some water and stop being theatrical. Another mom joined in, saying this was why she only gave her kids pre-cut foods, because some parents don't understand basic safety precautions. I watched the little girl's face turn red as she clutched her throat, unable to make any sounds now, and her lips started going blue while the moms continued chatting about their weekend plans. Her mother finally looked over and screamed when she saw her daughter's color, frozen in panic while the child collapsed to her knees. The other mom started shrieking and running around uselessly, with Grace yelling for someone to call 911 and another crying that the child was dying. I jumped up and rushed to the girl, immediately recognizing the signs of complete airway obstruction. As I positioned myself behind her and prepared to perform the pediatric Heimlich maneuver, Grace grabbed my arm, screaming that I didn't know what I was doing and would hurt her worse. I shook her off and wrapped my arms around the child, placing my fist just above her belly button. "Stop!" the mother screamed. "You're going to kill her! Someone get this dropout off my baby!" I pushed past Angela's flailing arms and positioned my hands correctly, one fist above Sophia's belly button with my other hand wrapped around it. The first thrust made Sophia's body jerk, but nothing came out. Angela grabbed at my shoulders, trying to pull me away while screaming that I was hurting her daughter. The second thrust was harder, and I felt Sophia's ribs compress under the pressure. Grace lunged forward but stopped when the third thrust sent a whole grape shooting out of Sophia's mouth, bouncing off the coffee table and rolling under the couch. Sophia gasped and started coughing hard, her face going from blue to red as air rushed back into her lungs. I kept my arms around her, feeling her chest rise and fall while checking her pulse at her neck. Angela dropped to her knees beside us, tears streaming down her face as she reached for Sophia, who was still coughing but breathing on her own. She kept whispering the same words over and over while the other moms stood frozen around us. Grace's hands shook as she fumbled with her phone, telling the operator that a child had choked but someone had helped, refusing to say my name or look at me. I kept Sophia sitting upright and rubbed her back while she coughed, watching her lips turn pink again and her eyes focus properly. Angela's hands hovered over her daughter like she wanted to grab her but was afraid to move her. I explained that we needed paramedics to check Sophia's throat because the grape might have caused damage on the way down or back up. Jackson pulled on my shirt and I told him his friend would be okay while keeping one arm around Sophia, who leaned against me, still breathing hard. The other moms whispered in the corner, their eyes darting between me and Sophia but never making direct contact with mine. 8 minutes felt like hours before we heard sirens approaching. The EMTs rushed in with their gear, and I immediately gave them the rundown while still holding Sophia steady. They looked surprised when I used proper medical terms, but the lead EMT just nodded and asked for my certification number while Grace interrupted to explain I was just the babysitter. He ignored her completely and started examining Sophia while I rattled off my number. Angela wouldn't let go of my hand as they checked Sophia's throat with a light, begging me to stay with them. Grace pulled her aside and I heard her whispering that Angela shouldn't trust me, that I could have made things worse or hurt Sophia more. Angela yanked her arm away and her voice carried across the room when she snapped back at Grace. The EMTs confirmed Sophia's airway was clear, but recommended taking her to the hospital for observation since she'd been without oxygen for over a minute. Angela immediately asked if I could ride with them in the ambulance. Grace stepped between us and the door, saying I'd done enough damage and shouldn't be involved anymore. One of the other moms had her phone out, holding it at an angle that meant she was was definitely recording while pretending to text. My voice came out steady but cold when I finally spoke up, asking Grace what damage she meant when I'd just saved a child's life while she worried about my tattoos. Her face went red and she started insisting she was about to help, that she knew what to do. The EMT supervisor had been listening from the doorway and stepped in to ask what was happening, his expression getting harder as Grace tried to explain her position. He asked for my name and certification, then his face changed completely when I told him. He shook my hand and mentioned the Riverside apartment fire from last year, saying he'd lost count of how many kids I'd pulled out of that building. Grace's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. An hour later, I sat in the hospital waiting room with Jackson on my lap, having called Mrs. Miller to explain everything. She'd wanted to leave work immediately, but I told her we were fine, and I'd bring Jackson home after making sure Sophia was okay. Angela came out of the ER with red eyes and practically ran to me, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. She tried to tell me what the doctor said but couldn't finish her sentence, just kept squeezing me harder. Dr. Brooks followed her out and his face lit up when he saw me. He told Angela I was one of their best, loud enough for Grace and the other moms who'd followed us to hear every word. Grace suddenly found her phone screen very interesting while Dr. Brooks shook my hand and said he'd trust me with his own kids any day. I wonder why Grace is so focused on credentials and degrees when she clearly doesn't know basic first aid herself. This whole group seems more interested in comparing nanny resumes than actually watching these kids. Nobody noticed that poor girl turning blue until it was almost too late. Grace's wedding ring made this annoying clicking sound against her phone screen as she typed away in the corner of the waiting room, shooting me these nasty looks every few seconds while Angela kept thanking me, and Dr. Brooks headed back to check on other patients. One of the moms who'd been at the playdate walked over to me with this guilty look on her face and started to say something about being sorry for how they'd treated me earlier, but Grace hissed at her from across the room to remember whose side she was on, and the woman basically ran back to the group like a scared kid. I stayed with Angela for another 2 hours while they monitored Sophia, watching Grace tap away at her phone the whole time with this look on her face like she was planning something. And when Mrs. Miller finally showed up to get Jackson after leaving work early, she'd already heard the whole story from the EMTs who'd filled her in on what happened. She grabbed me in this huge hug right there in front of everyone and told me she'd never been prouder to have me watching Jackson, that she knew hiring me was the best decision she'd ever made, while Grace watched from her corner with her eyes all narrow and her fingers still flying across her phone screen like she was typing a novel. The drive home felt weird after everything that happened, and by the time I got to my apartment around 7 that night, I was completely wiped out, my knees all grass-stained from kneeling next to Sophia on Grace's lawn, and my hands still shaking a little from the adrenaline crash. My roommate asked what happened when she saw the state of my clothes, and while I was explaining about the choking and the Heimlich and the crazy moms, my phone started going nuts with Facebook notifications like someone had tagged me in something that was getting a ton of activity. I opened the app and saw I'd been tagged in a post in the Westchester Moms Network group, which had like 10,000 members, and was basically the go-to place for all the suburban moms in the area to share recommendations and gossip. And when I clicked on it, my stomach just dropped. Grace had written this long post claiming I'd assaulted a child at her home, that I'd performed dangerous maneuvers without consent, and traumatized everyone there, making it sound like I was some kind of violent criminal who'd attacked her kid instead of saving Sophia's life. The comments were already piling up with all these outraged responses about unqualified teenage babysitters and how dare someone like me put children at risk, and I watched the comment count climb from 50 to 100 to 200 in just the 10 minutes I sat there staring at my phone. Then my phone started ringing, and it was Mrs. Miller, her voice all shaky as she told me 3 of her mom friends had already forwarded her Grace's post asking if I was the babysitter she used, and even though she kept telling me she knew it was all lies and she'd defend me to anyone who asked, I could hear how worried she was about what this meant for my reputation. Grace had tagged my full name in the post, and even included a photo of me from today that she must have taken when I wasn't looking, so now thousands of strangers knew exactly who I was and what I looked like. I started scrolling through the comments, and it got worse and worse, finding people sharing my full name, my photo, even screenshots of my LinkedIn profile that someone had hunted down, and one mom had found my Instagram and was posting screenshots of my tattoos as evidence that I wasn't suitable to be around children. Every time someone tried to comment something positive or ask for more details about what actually happened, Grace would jump in with more lies, claiming I'd refused to let the real adults help and that I'd used excessive force on a small child, painting this picture of me as some reckless teenager who'd endangered everyone. My phone rang again around 11 that night, and it was Angela, crying so hard I could barely understand her at first, telling me Grace was threatening to sue her if she publicly contradicted the story or defended me online. She said Grace's husband was a partner at some big law firm, and Grace was using that to scare her into staying quiet, claiming that Sophia could have been saved without violence if I'd just let Grace handle it, which was insane since Grace had been the one screaming and trying to stop me from helping. Angela kept apologizing over and over, saying she wanted to help me but she was terrified of what Grace might do, and I told her it wasn't her fault, even though I felt sick thinking about how Grace was bullying the woman whose daughter I'd saved. I barely slept that night, and when I woke up the next morning my phone showed 47 missed calls and more texts than I could count, and when I started going through them I realized 3 of my regular babysitting families had canceled upcoming jobs citing concerns they'd seen online. Then I saw an email that made my blood run cold. My paramedic certification board had received a formal complaint about my conduct and would be investigating, which could mean losing my certification if they believed Grace's lies. Grace's post had over 500 shares and 2,000 comments by then, spreading through mom groups all over Westchester and beyond, my name and photo being passed around like I was some kind of wanted criminal. I was sitting there trying to figure out what to do when Angela texted asking if I could meet her at a coffee shop in an hour, saying it was important and she had something that might help. So I threw on clothes and drove over there with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a back corner booth looking around nervously like she was worried someone might see us together, and when I sat down she slid a flash drive across the table with trembling hands. She leaned in close and whispered that it was nanny cam footage from her purse, that she always recorded playdates for her own peace of mind, and the camera had caught everything. Me saving Sophia's life while Grace screamed at me to stop and tried to physically pull me away from her daughter. Angela said she'd watched it a dozen times already, and it clearly showed I'd done everything right while Grace had actively interfered with emergency aid assistant, and even though she was terrified of Grace's threats, she couldn't let me take the fall for saving her daughter's life. I drove straight from the coffee shop to meet with a lawyer my EMT supervisor had recommended when I'd called him that morning, and after she watched the footage on her laptop, her whole expression changed from professional concern to genuine anger. She replayed the part where Grace grabbed my arm while I was performing the Heimlich, shaking her head as she explained that this was technically assault on a minor responder and interference interference with emergency medical aid, both of which could result in criminal charges. The lawyer said Grace could face serious legal consequences for trying to prevent me from saving a child's life, especially with such clear video evidence, and that her defamation campaign on social media was adding even more potential charges to the list. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still in bed, and Mrs. Miller's voice sounded shaky when she told me she'd been kicked out of 2 playdate groups overnight. The group admins had sent her messages saying they couldn't have someone who employed dangerous caregivers in their circles, and one mom had actually called her at work to say she was being irresponsible keeping me around. Jackson had been asking all morning why his friend Tommy's mom said he couldn't come over anymore, and she didn't know what to tell him because how do you explain adult pettiness to a 4-year-old who just wants to play with his dinosaurs? She kept apologizing for calling me so early, but I could hear the stress in her voice as she explained that 3 different moms had cornered her at pickup yesterday, demanding to know if she was really going to keep employing that girl who attacked Grace's friend. By afternoon, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw the original post about me had grown to over 500 comments, and some woman claiming to be a pediatric nurse was writing paragraphs about how my aggressive technique could have caused internal damage. She'd never been at the playdate, never seen what happened, but she was analyzing frame-by-frame screenshots someone had posted, circling my hand placement and adding medical terms to make herself sound official. Grace was hearting every negative comment and replying with things like, "Thank you for your professional insight," while completely ignoring the actual paramedics and doctors who were trying to correct the misinformation. My paramedic friends from training were fighting back in the comments, posting links to the Red Cross guidelines and explaining that what I did was textbook pediatric choking response, but Grace kept deleting their comments or reporting them as harassment. The fake nurse kept insisting that children should never receive violent abdominal thrusts, and that I should have just encouraged the child to cough, which made me want to scream because you can't cough when your airway is completely blocked. 3 days later, I walked into the fire station for my EMT shift and found my supervisor Jim waiting in his office with a stack of papers and a grim expression. Someone had filed a formal complaint with the state board claiming I was unstable and violent and had a pattern of aggressive behavior toward children, and even though he knew it was complete garbage, he had to follow protocol and document everything. He showed me the complaint form where they'd checked every possible violation box, including substance abuse and mental instability, based on absolutely nothing except Grace's lies. Grace's fingers flying across her phone screen while the kid she failed to save is still being monitored? That's some next-level cold behavior right there. Jim said he'd already written his response supporting me completely, but warned that the investigation could affect my certification renewal, and I felt my stomach drop because this job wasn't just income, it was my entire career path. That evening, Angela texted asking if I could come over, and when I arrived, Sophia came running down the driveway shouting, "My hero!" before wrapping her arms around my legs. Inside, Angela had her laptop open with screenshot after screenshot of a private Facebook group where Grace was coordinating her campaign, telling other moms exactly what complaints to file and where, even providing template letters they could copy and paste. The messages showed Grace instructing people to mention my tattoos as signs of poor judgment, and to emphasize how I'd grabbed her friend's child without permission, completely twisting the life-saving intervention into some kind of assault. Angela was documenting everything, but looked exhausted as she explained how Grace had been calling other moms all day, threatening to exclude them from the annual Christmas party and the summer pool club if they didn't support her version of events. The next morning, I was sitting at Angela's kitchen table helping Sophia with a coloring book when we heard a car door slam, and Angela peeked through the blinds to see one of the playdate moms taking photos of my car in the driveway. Within an hour, Angela's phone was buzzing with a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Grace's husband's law firm, and by lunch, a courier was at the door with an official cease and desist letter printed on expensive letterhead. The letter threatened legal action if Angela shared any photos, videos, or defamatory content about Grace, and specifically mentioned the security footage from the playdate, claiming it was recorded without consent and sharing it would violate privacy laws. Angela's hands were shaking as she read it because she knew they had good lawyers and deep pockets, while she was a single mom working 2 jobs who couldn't afford a legal battle. The morning of day 4, my phone rang while I was making coffee, and Dr. Brooks sounded furious as she explained that Grace's lawyer had contacted the hospital, demanding she retract any statements supporting me. They'd threatened to report her to the medical board for violating patient privacy by discussing Sophia's treatment, even though Angela had given full permission, and were demanding she sign a statement saying she couldn't confirm whether my actions were appropriate or not. She told me she'd already contacted the hospital's legal department and was preparing a formal medical report about Sophia's treatment that clearly stated she would have died without immediate intervention, and I could hear the anger in her voice when she said that woman would have let a child die just to protect her ego. That same day, I discovered the real extent of Grace's reach when my phone stayed completely silent, despite usually getting multiple texts about babysitting jobs by noon. I checked my babysitting app and found 3 cancellations from regular families with vague excuses about schedule changes, and when I texted one mom I'd been working for over a year, she didn't respond for hours before finally admitting Grace had contacted everyone in their Mommy and Me group. She sent me a screenshot of Grace's message warning that anyone who hired me would be enabling dangerous behavior and would be excluded from all group activities, including the popular music class they all attended and the weekly playground meetups that were basically mandatory for social survival in their circle. By day 5, my lawyer Sarah was ready to fight back, filing a counter cease and desist against Grace for defamation and interference with business relationships, along with a formal complaint to the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges for interfering with emergency medical aid. She explained that preventing someone from saving a choking child could be considered reckless endangerment, and with multiple witnesses and video evidence, Grace could face actual jail time if the DA decided to pursue it. The legal paperwork was dense, but Sarah translated it simply as Grace had messed with the wrong person and was about to find out that her husband's fancy lawyers couldn't protect her from criminal charges. Day 6 started with another legal bombshell when Grace escalated by filing for a restraining order, claiming I was stalking and harassing her through my friend's social media posts. She'd printed out every single comment defending me and highlighted parts where people called her negligent or dangerous, presenting it as evidence of a coordinated harassment campaign that I was orchestrating. The hearing was set for the following week, and the temporary order meant I couldn't go within 500 feet of her home, or any place she might be, which basically meant I couldn't work for half my clients since they all lived in the same neighborhood. That evening, I was surrounded by legal papers and printed screenshots when Mrs. Miller knocked on my door carrying a casserole dish and holding Jackson's hand. She took one look at the mess on my coffee table and set the food down before pulling me into a hug, and Jackson immediately climbed onto the couch next to me with a piece of paper he'd been clutching. He'd drawn me in a red cape standing next to a little girl with Hero written in shaky 4-year-old handwriting above it, and when he asked why Mrs. Grace was being mean to me, I honestly didn't know how to answer because how do you explain to a child that some adults care more about their image than children's lives? My phone started buzzing while Jackson was still coloring, and when I saw Angela's name on the screen, my stomach dropped because she never called me directly. Her voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand her at first, but then the words started making sense, and I felt my whole body go cold as she explained that Grace had filed a report with Child Protective Services claiming she'd endangered Sophia by letting an unqualified person assault her daughter. The report specifically said Angela had failed to protect Sophia from me, and now CPS was opening an investigation into her parenting. I watched Jackson happily drawing more pictures while Angela sobbed on the phone about how they were questioning whether she was a fit mother, and I couldn't believe Grace would go this far just because I'd saved her daughter's life. The next morning, I woke up to my phone exploding with texts from friends asking if I'd seen the news, and when I turned on the TV, there was my face plastered across the local morning show with a headline, "Babysitter Controversy Divides Wealthy Suburb," while they showed the worst possible photo from Grace's social media post. The reporter was standing outside Grace's house interviewing her about how terrified she was that someone like me was allowed near children, and they kept noting that I'd declined to comment, even though nobody had ever contacted me for my side of the story. Within hours, my EMT colleagues started posting videos online explaining the proper pediatric Heimlich maneuver and why every second counts during a choking emergency, with several of them specifically mentioning my name and confirming I'd followed protocol perfectly. The paramedic union released an official statement supporting my actions, but Grace's mom group immediately countered by claiming we were just protecting our own, instead of thinking about the children's safety. By the next day, I couldn't even go to the grocery store without people recognizing me from the news coverage. I was reaching for milk when I heard a woman loudly telling her friend that I was that violent babysitter from TV, and another shopper immediately jumped in saying she'd seen the real story online about how I'd actually saved a kid's life, which started a full argument right there in aisle 3 with people taking sides. My lawyer called me in for deposition prep and spread out printouts of Grace's social media history going back years, showing me post after post where she'd targeted people she thought were beneath her, including 2 previous nannies who'd quit after harassment campaigns, a house cleaner she'd accused of theft with no evidence, and a contractor she'd tried to destroy online because he'd parked his work truck in front of her house. She'd done this before, but never at this scale, never with news coverage and legal threats and an entire community watching. That same afternoon, Angela texted me that Sophia had been asking for me every single day, calling me her angel and wanting to thank me for saving her, but they'd had to tell her she couldn't see me because of all the legal issues. Angela's marriage was falling apart under the stress of the CPS investigation with her husband, blaming her for trusting me with their daughter, even though I'd literally saved Sophia's life. The restraining order hearing date arrived faster than expected, and I walked into the courthouse to find Grace already there with 3 lawyers in expensive suits and a thick folder of what she called evidence. She'd styled herself perfectly for court, looking like the concerned suburban mother protecting her community, and several of her friends filled the gallery seats behind her for support. When Grace took the stand, she started crying on cue while describing how I'd violently attacked a child and created a climate of fear in their neighborhood, where mothers were now terrified to leave their children with anyone. She claimed she couldn't sleep at night knowing I was out there with access to other innocent children, and the judge seemed to be buying every word from this well-dressed, articulate mother. Then my lawyer stood up and said he had one piece of evidence to present, pulling out a tablet and explaining that Angela had a nanny cam in her living room that had captured the entire incident. Grace filed a CPS report against Angela for letting me save her daughter's life. That's crossing into territory that makes me question what's really driving her. This goes way beyond protecting her image or pride. The courtroom went completely silent as everyone watched the footage of me saving Sophia's life, while Grace screamed at me to stop and physically tried to pull me away from the choking child. Grace's lawyers objected frantically, saying the footage was obtained illegally, but the damage was already done as the judge watched Grace actively interfering with emergency life-saving aid while her daughter's lips turned blue. The judge's entire expression changed as he watched Grace grab my arms and try to stop me from performing the Heimlich maneuver, and when the video ended showing Sophia breathing again thanks to my actions, he turned to look at Grace with obvious disgust. Not only did he deny the restraining order, but he stated on record that Grace might face criminal charges for filing a false police report and interfering with emergency medical aid. He commended my actions and noted that interfering with someone providing life-saving assistance was a serious offense that could have resulted in a child's death. Grace stormed out of the courtroom with her lawyers scrambling after her, while her supporters sat frozen in shock at how quickly their narrative had fallen apart. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications as the local news ran a segment titled, "Video Vindicates Babysitter in Choking Incident," and suddenly everyone who'd been calling me a monster wanted to hear my side. Grace's Facebook group went into full damage control mode with some members posting that they'd been misled about what really happened, while others doubled down claiming the security footage must have been edited or doctored somehow. I scrolled through the comments while eating breakfast and watched as the group split into 2 camps with mothers arguing about whether Grace had lied to them or if she'd just been confused in the heat of the moment. That evening my doorbell rang and I found Angela standing there with Sophia, despite her lawyer probably telling her to stay away from me. The little girl held up a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings of stick figures and the words, "Thank you for saving me," written in shaky letters across the top. Angela's eyes were red as she explained that the CPS investigator had watched the security footage 3 times and was getting ready to close the case since it clearly showed I'd saved her daughter's life. She hugged me on my doorstep while Sophia wrapped her arms around my legs, and I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since this whole nightmare started. Over the next day, my phone filled with texts from families I'd worked for over the years, with some apologizing for doubting me, and 2 offering me work starting immediately if I needed it. But plenty of others stayed silent, and I knew the damage to my reputation would last way longer than any news cycle, even with video proof on my side. The DA's office put out a statement saying they were opening an investigation into Grace for interfering with emergency medical aid and filing false police reports, which could mean serious charges. Within hours, her husband's law firm quietly announced they were no longer representing her in any capacity, and by that afternoon, she'd hired a well-known criminal defense attorney who specialized in keeping rich people out of jail. Grace's new strategy became clear when her lawyer released a statement claiming she'd been traumatized by watching a child nearly die and wasn't thinking clearly when she tried to stop me from helping. Her remaining supporters launched something called the Mothers in Crisis campaign, arguing that prosecuting a mother for trying to protect children would set a dangerous precedent and criminalize maternal instincts. They organized protests and flooded social media with stories about mothers who'd made mistakes in moments of panic and shouldn't be punished for caring too much. A local news producer called asking if I'd I'd do an on-camera interview to tell my side of the story, and after thinking it over, I agreed, even though the idea of being on TV made my stomach flip. The morning of the interview, I put on my EMT uniform with all my patches and pins showing my certifications because I wanted everyone to see exactly who I was. Outside the station, about 20 protesters held signs reading, "Protect our children" and "Credentials matter," while chanting about keeping kids safe from unqualified caregivers. I walked past them with my head high and my uniform pressed crisp, even as they yelled that I was exploiting a tragedy for fame. Inside the studio, the host seemed surprised by how calm and professional I was as we sat down under the bright lights. The red recording light blinked on, and she asked me to walk through my qualifications, which I did matter-of-factly, listing my years of training and experience. When she brought up what happened at the playdate, I explained each step I took to save Sophia using proper medical terminology, but keeping it simple enough for viewers to understand. She asked about Grace, and I looked straight at the camera and said simply that a child nearly died while she worried about my appearance instead of letting me help. The interview aired that night, and within hours it had been shared thousands of times with medical professionals from around the world commenting on the textbook response to pediatric choking. The hashtag #JustTheBabysitter started trending, with childcare workers sharing their own stories of being underestimated or dismissed despite their training and experience. Grace's Mothers in Crisis campaign started losing steam as more people watched the actual footage and heard from real medical experts about how close Sophia had come to dying. The next day, Mrs. Miller called to say she was organizing a support gathering at her house for all the families I'd worked with over the years who wanted to show they stood behind me. 12 families showed up that evening, filling her living room with parents and kids I'd cared for since I started babysitting at 16. One mother got choked up telling everyone about the time I'd noticed her son's allergic reaction before she did and got him to the hospital in time, while another shared how I'd taught her daughter to manage her anxiety during thunderstorms. The kids made a banner that said, "Emma saves the day," and hung it across the mantle while their parents shared stories and hugged me tight. Just when I thought things might actually be turning around, my lawyer called the next morning to tell me Grace had filed a defamation lawsuit seeking $500,000 in damages. She claimed my TV interview had destroyed her reputation and caused severe emotional distress, including PTSD that required intensive therapy. Her filing included a psychiatric evaluation stating she couldn't sleep, had panic attacks whenever she saw children eating, and had been forced to withdraw from all her social activities due to the shame and trauma I'd caused by speaking publicly about the incident. The preliminary hearing for Grace's criminal charges came 3 weeks later at the Westchester County Courthouse, where I sat behind the prosecutor watching Grace fidget in her designer suit while witness after witness took the stand. The first mom from the playdate twisted her wedding ring as she testified that Grace had grabbed my arm and tried to pull me away while Sophia was choking. But when the defense lawyer pressed her, she started backtracking and saying maybe she misremembered because everything happened so fast. Another mom testified that Grace definitely interfered, but then admitted she'd been focused on her own child and couldn't be sure exactly what Grace did or said. The prosecutor showed the security footage from Grace's own home system that clearly showed her physically restraining me for several seconds while Sophia's face turned blue, and even Grace's own lawyer seemed uncomfortable watching it play out on the courtroom monitor. The judge scheduled the actual trial for 3 months out and denied the defense's motion to dismiss, stating there was sufficient evidence that Grace's actions could have resulted in a child's death. The next morning, Grace's husband served her with separation papers at their house, and by noon she'd posted a tearful video on social media claiming I'd destroyed her family and ruined her life over a simple misunderstanding. Her supporters immediately started a GoFundMe that raised $12,000 in 6 hours, with comments calling me a homewrecker and saying Grace was being persecuted for trying to protect children from an unqualified teenager. I tried to ignore the online drama by throwing myself back into EMT work full-time, walking into the station to find my locker covered in printed screenshots of supportive comments from the viral video and a banner reading "Our Hero" hanging above it. My partner had left a sticky note on my equipment that said, "Heroes come with tattoos too," and the whole crew had chipped in to buy me a custom purple stethoscope to match my hair. The normalcy of running calls and helping people who actually appreciated my skills felt like coming home after months of craziness, and I found myself sleeping better after 12-hour shifts than I had since this whole mess started. Angela called me crying with relief the next day when CPS officially closed her case with no findings, sobbing that she'd been terrified they'd take Sophia away because she'd let me babysit. She posted publicly for the first time supporting me, writing a long message about how I'd saved her daughter's life and how grateful she was, but within 10 minutes, Grace's supporters flooded her comments calling her an unfit mother and threatening to report her to CPS again for defending a dangerous babysitter. My lawyer called me at work the next morning telling me to sit down because what he was about to show me would make me angry, then forwarded screenshots from a whistleblower in Grace's mom group showing messages where Grace explicitly instructed other moms to file false complaints about me to licensing boards, CPS, and the health department. Grace's lawyer calling her behavior maternal instinct is like calling a food fight nutritional distribution. Technically words exist, but the meaning got lost somewhere between reality and legal fees. The worst message had Grace writing, "I don't care if it's true, just make her life hell until she disappears," along with a list of agencies to contact and suggested allegations to make. My hands shook as I read through dozens of messages showing Grace coordinating a harassment campaign, assigning different moms to file different complaints so it wouldn't look orchestrated, even providing a template with specific wording to use. My lawyer immediately filed everything with the court and the prosecutor, and within hours, 3 different agencies confirmed they'd received nearly identical complaints about me, all submitted within the same 2-day period. The prosecutor upgraded Grace's charges to include conspiracy and criminal harassment, and several of the moms who'd participated faced potential charges for filing false reports. The mom group's Facebook page turned into chaos as members realized they could face actual legal consequences, with some posting public apologies and retracting their complaints, while others claimed Grace had manipulated them, and they didn't know the complaints were false. The group administrators shut down the page completely after someone leaked all the private messages to a local news station, and suddenly Grace's carefully crafted image of a concerned mother was shattered by her own words instructing people to lie to destroy a teenager's life. Angela organized a playdate specifically to support me, inviting only families who believed my side of the story, and I nearly cried when I walked in to see Sophia run up to me yelling, "Miss Emma saved me," to everyone who would listen. Other parents shared stories about Grace's past behavior, how she targeted other moms she didn't like, spread rumors about families who didn't fit her perfect suburban image, and used her social influence to exclude people from community events. The owner of my favorite coffee shop recognized me the next morning and refused to let me pay, creating a special drink called the Hero Babysitter with purple foam art, and soon other local businesses started offering free meals and services services after following the story online. The community support helped ease some of the pain from the attacks, especially when the pizza place delivered free dinner to the EMT station for our whole crew, with a note thanking me for standing up to bullies. Grace's lawyer contacted mine 3 days later, requesting a meeting to discuss a plea deal where she'd drop her civil suit if the criminal charges were reduced to a misdemeanor, but the DA refused immediately, stating that interfering with emergency medical aid set a dangerous precedent that required prosecution. A month later, I got an email from the American Academy of Pediatrics asking if I'd speak at their upcoming conference about emergency response and bystander interference, which seemed like a good way to help other people avoid what happened to me. The conference organizer explained they'd been following my case and wanted to use it as a teaching example for medical professionals about the dangers of untrained people blocking emergency aid. I agreed immediately and started preparing my presentation, but 2 days later my lawyer called saying Grace's legal team filed an emergency motion to block my appearance, claiming it would prejudice potential jurors against their client. The judge threw it out in less than 5 minutes, saying I had every right to discuss my professional experience and educate others about proper emergency protocols. Grace's lawyer tried arguing that any public discussion of the case violated some imaginary gag order, but the judge reminded him that no such order existed and warned him about filing frivolous motions. 5 days before the conference, I was scrolling through Instagram when I got a message request from an account with no profile picture and a random string of numbers for a username. The message said, "Emma, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but I really need this to go away. I'll give you $50,000 cash if you drop the charges and move somewhere far away. This whole thing has destroyed my life and my daughter needs her mother. Please consider my offer." I screenshot everything immediately and called the detective handling the case, who traced the IP address back to Grace's home computer. Within 3 hours, police showed up at her house with an arrest warrant for witness tampering and violating her bail conditions. She spent the night in county jail before her lawyer could arrange an emergency bail hearing, and when she appeared before the judge the next morning, she looked nothing like the put-together suburban mom from the playdate. Her hair was messy, her designer clothes replaced with wrinkled basics, and her hands shook as she stood there while the prosecutor explained how she'd tried to bribe me to disappear. The judge revoked her bail completely, saying she'd proven herself a flight risk and a danger to the integrity of the judicial process. Only 2 people showed up to support her, down from the dozens who'd protested outside the police station initially, and even they looked uncomfortable when the prosecutor read my screenshot messages out loud. A week after Grace went to jail, I was at the park with Jackson and Mrs. Miller when he asked when he could have playdates again with his friends from the old group. Mrs. Miller knelt down and explained that they'd found new friends now, better friends whose mommies and daddies worked hard like she did, and understood that Miss Emma was a hero, not just a babysitter. She told me later that losing Grace's social circle was the best thing that ever happened to her, because she'd connected with other working parents who actually respected childcare providers and didn't judge her for having a career. Over the next few weeks, I started getting Facebook messages from women who'd been at that playdate, each one apologizing and trying to explain their behavior. One admitted she'd only joined in mocking me because Grace would exclude anyone who didn't follow her lead, describing how Grace kept a mental list of who was loyal and who needed to be punished with social exile. Another revealed that Grace had dirt on several group members, using knowledge of affairs, financial troubles, and family secrets to maintain control over her circle. She said everyone was terrified of becoming Grace's next target, so they'd learn to attack whoever she pointed at first. The deposition started 2 months after the arrest, and Grace's former friends painted a picture of someone who ran her social circle like a cult leader. They described required loyalty tests where Grace would spread rumors about someone to see who would repeat them back to the victim, punishing anyone who warned the target or refused to participate. One woman broke down crying while explaining how Grace had convinced everyone to shun her sister for 6 months after she'd questioned Grace's treatment of a nanny, only allowing contact again after the sister publicly apologized at a group dinner. The prosecutor's expert witness, a psychologist who'd evaluated Grace, testified that she showed clear signs of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, explaining how she needed constant admiration and control while lacking empathy for anyone she saw as beneath her. A week after the depositions ended, I got a call from the director of a prestigious childcare training center asking if I'd be interested in teaching emergency response courses to their students. She said my case had highlighted a massive gap in education about bystander interference and proper emergency protocols, and they wanted someone with real-world experience to help prepare future childcare providers. The salary was triple what I made babysitting, with full benefits and the chance to save lives by teaching others what to do in crisis situations. My first day teaching, I walked into a classroom of 30 eager students, several of whom recognized me from news coverage and said they'd decided to pursue childcare careers after seeing how I'd handled the emergency. One young woman stayed after class to tell me she was planning to get her EMT certification because of my story, saying she'd never realized how important medical training was for anyone working with children. 2 weeks into my new job, Grace's remaining supporters tried one last desperate move, organizing what they called a rally for maternal rights outside the courthouse. When I drove by on my lunch break, I counted exactly 12 people holding signs about government overreach and the criminalization of motherhood, while across the street stood 3 times as many counter-protesters, including parents whose kids I'd babysat and medical professionals supporting proper emergency response. The local news barely mentioned it, running a 10-second clip at the end of their broadcast, with the anchor noting that public opinion had shifted dramatically since the initial incident. The next Monday, Grace's lawyer filed a motion to withdraw from the case, her 4th legal team to quit, citing irreconcilable differences with his client. Her new attorneys immediately requested a postponement, claiming they needed months to review the case files, but the judge shut them down hard, saying Grace had been using lawyer changes as a delay tactic for too long. He set the trial date for the following month with no further extensions allowed, warning that any more attempts to postpone would result in additional charges for obstruction of justice. The weeks crawled by as trial prep consumed my life, and I found myself actually sleeping through the night for the first time since the whole mess started, because the constant panic had shifted into something harder, like steel forming in my spine every time I thought about facing Grace in court. My lawyer kept showing me stacks of evidence during our meetings, pointing at highlighted sections of Grace's social media posts and the dozens of witness statements from people at the playdate, and he'd lean back in his chair with this confident smile saying we had more proof than most prosecutors dream of. Grace tried to bribe Emma with $50,000 to disappear? That's a lot of money for someone who claimed to just be protecting children. Makes me wonder what she's really afraid of people finding out about her past behavior. Angela called me one night crying because Grace's friends were still leaving nasty voicemails about her being a traitor, but she promised she'd testify no matter what they said or did to her family. When jury selection finally started on day 100, I sat in the courtroom watching Grace's lawyers try every trick to keep anyone with medical training or kids off the jury, asking asking pointed questions about whether they'd ever hired babysitters or had strong feelings about childcare, but the judge kept shutting them down and limiting how many people they could dismiss. The final jury had nurses, teachers, parents, even a pediatrician who Grace's lawyer fought hard to remove but couldn't find a legal reason to exclude. Opening statements on the first trial day felt like watching two different movies about the same event, with the prosecutor calmly walking the jury through the timeline while the massive screen showed Grace's own video where you could hear her screaming at me to stop saving Sophia. Then her lawyer stood up claiming Grace suffered temporary insanity from maternal panic watching a child in danger. Several jurors actually rolled their eyes when he said I was just a reckless teenager who got lucky, and one woman in the front row shook her head when he tried to paint Grace as the real victim. The second day they called me to testify, and I spent 3 hours walking through every second of that day, from arriving at the playdate to performing the Heimlich while Grace tried to pull me away. And when her lawyer started his cross-examination asking if I really had proper training, I stayed calm and listed every certification date, every protocol number, every hour of training I'd completed. He kept trying to make me look reckless and unqualified, suggesting I'd acted without thinking, but the prosecutor kept objecting and showing the video where Grace literally grabbed my arms while I was mid-compression on a choking child. Then came the moment that changed everything when Grace's lawyer asked sarcastically if I'd ever actually saved anyone before that day, trying to imply I was inexperienced, and the prosecutor jumped up saying he'd opened the door to my full professional history, which meant I could now detail every single rescue I'd performed. I spent the next hour listing the 7-year-old who'd drowned at the community pool, the diabetic teenager who'd gone into shock at the mall, the elderly man with a heart attack at the grocery store, the baby with a severe allergic reaction, going through each save with dates and outcomes while Grace visibly shrank in her chair. Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge reminded him he'd asked the question himself, and by the time I finished describing my recommendation letters from the fire chief and head of emergency services, 2 jurors were wiping their eyes. Angela's testimony on day 3 broke my heart as she sobbed, describing how she'd frozen watching Sophia turn blue, how she'd thought her baby was dying right in front of her, how I'd pushed past everyone to save her daughter while Grace physically tried to stop the rescue. Grace's lawyer barely asked her any questions, probably knowing the jury's sympathy was completely against them, especially when Angela looked directly at Grace and said she'd never forgive her for almost killing Sophia with her interference. Dr. Brooks took the stand on day 4 as an expert witness, using medical diagrams to show exactly what happens during choking and explaining that Sophia had maybe 2 minutes left before permanent brain damage or death. And when he demonstrated how Grace's interference could have been fatal by showing the exact arm positions on a mannequin, one juror actually gasped. The other playdate moms testified on day 5 with varying levels of loyalty to Grace, but under oath most admitted she'd grabbed me and tried to stop the rescue, with one breaking down completely and apologizing to me right there on the stand, saying Grace had threatened to destroy her husband's landscaping business if she didn't support her story. During a break on day 6, I was getting water from the fountain when I felt small arms wrap around my waist, and I looked down to see Sophia hugging me tight, while Angela smiled nearby, and across the hallway Grace stood frozen watching the child she'd almost let die clinging to the person who'd saved her. Grace's face crumpled for just a second, showing what might have been real remorse for the first time since this all started, before her lawyer pulled her away. Against her legal team's clear wishes, Grace insisted on testifying on day 7, taking the stand with her chin high, trying to maintain her story about being a concerned mother protecting children from a dangerous teenager, but the prosecutor systematically destroyed her claims using her own Facebook posts, text messages, and the video evidence. She finally admitted to organizing the harassment campaign against me, but claimed it was justified because I'd traumatized everyone at the playdate, and when the prosecutor asked if she thought letting Sophia die would have been less traumatic, she couldn't answer and just stared at her hands. The next day, my lawyer called Mrs. Miller to the stand first, and she walked up there with her shoulders straight and told everyone how I'd been watching Jackson for 2 years without a single problem, how I always arrived early and stayed late when she got stuck at work, how Jackson would run to the door every time I showed up because he loved me so much. My EMT supervisor took the stand next and pulled out my training records, showing the judge how I'd scored in the top 5% of my class, how I'd already saved 3 lives during my shifts, how other paramedics requested to work with me because I stayed calm under pressure. 3 other families I'd worked for came forward too, each one describing how I'd handled their kids' allergies and tantrums and homework struggles, how their children still asked about me months later. The prosecutor played security footage from the hospital showing me in my EMT uniform helping bring in car accident victims, then asked the jury if this looked like someone who would hurt children. Grace's lawyer tried to argue that being good at your job didn't mean you couldn't make mistakes, but when he asked my supervisor if I'd ever frozen during an emergency, she said I was the most reliable person on her team. The closing arguments came the next morning, and the prosecutor stood in front of the jury holding up pictures of Sophia in the hospital, her face pink and healthy again because I'd saved her life. He walked them through every second of that day, how Grace had mocked my age and appearance, how she'd physically tried to stop me from helping a dying child, how she'd chosen her pride over a little girl's life, and then tried to destroy the person who'd done what she couldn't. He showed them the fake social media accounts, the threatening messages, the calls to my employers trying to get me fired, and asked them to imagine if every person who saved a life had to face this kind of harassment. Grace's lawyer stood up and asked for understanding, saying Grace was just a scared mother who'd panicked in a terrible moment, that she'd never meant for things to go so far, that losing her daughter's respect was punishment enough. But then he made the mistake of suggesting I could have announced my training before acting, and the prosecutor jumped up to remind everyone that unconscious children can't wait for credentials. The jury left to deliberate after lunch, and we sat in the hallway waiting while reporters kept trying to get statements, and Grace's remaining supporters huddled in the corner shooting me dirty looks. Angela sat next to me holding my hand while Mrs. Miller kept Jackson busy with coloring books, and even though my lawyer said the case was solid, my stomach stayed in knots because you never really know what 12 strangers will decide. 3 hours later, the bailiff called us back in, and as we filed into the courtroom, I saw Grace gripping her lawyer's hand so tight her knuckles went white. The jury members took their seats one by one, not looking at anyone, and Jackson climbed into my lap with his crayons still in his hand, drawing pictures of ambulances while we waited. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper, his voice steady as he said yes, they had. Guilty on all counts, he read. Interference with emergency medical aid, conspiracy to commit harassment, filing false police reports, witness intimidation, and Grace let out this wounded sound like someone had punched her in the stomach. The judge revoked her bail right there, saying she'd proven herself a danger to the community, and 2 officers moved forward with handcuffs while her supporters gasped and cried out that this wasn't fair. As they led her past our table, Grace turned to look at me one last time, her face pale and hollow, and mouthed the the words, "I'm sorry," before they took her through the side door. Angela squeezed my hand harder and whispered that it was over, but I didn't feel any joy or satisfaction, just this hollow relief that maybe I could finally sleep without checking my locks 3 times. The reporters surged forward as we left the courtroom, shoving microphones in my face and asking how it felt to win, if I forgave Grace, what I wanted to say to other young professionals facing discrimination. My lawyer guided me to the courthouse steps where even more cameras waited, and I stood there in my nicest outfit, the same purple streaks in my hair that Grace had sneered at, trying to find words that mattered. I kept it short, talking about how important it was for bystanders to get basic first aid training, how every second counts in an emergency, how trained professionals need to be allowed to do their jobs without interference. I thanked Mrs. Miller for standing by me, my EMT supervisor for supporting me, Angela for having the courage to tell the truth even when it meant going against her friend, Grace mouthing, "I'm sorry," while being led away in handcuffs hits different when you remember she spent months trying to ruin the person who saved a child's life. Timing really is everything in apologies. Then I dedicated the victory to all the EMTs and paramedics who save lives every day, often without recognition, sometimes while facing abuse from the very people they're trying to help. That evening, the Miller family insisted on taking me out to celebrate, and we went to this little Italian place where Jackson could get his favorite spaghetti and make as much mess as he wanted. Halfway through dinner, he presented me with a book he'd made out of construction paper and crayon, titled My Hero Emma, with pictures of me in my EMT uniform, saving people from fires and car crashes, and even dinosaur attacks. Other people in the restaurant recognized me from the news and sent over a huge chocolate cake, and the owner wouldn't let us pay for anything, saying anyone who saved children was welcome in his place anytime. Jackson fell asleep against my shoulder on the drive home, clutching his picture book, and Mrs. Miller told me she'd already gotten 3 calls from other families asking if I had any openings for babysitting. Life slowly settled back into something like normal over the next few months, though normal now meant balancing my EMT shifts with teaching first aid classes at the community center, and slowly rebuilding my babysitting client base. Some of the families from the Playdate group never called again, but new ones reached out specifically because they'd heard what happened and wanted someone who could handle emergencies. I'd run into people at the grocery store who thanked me for standing up to bullies, or sometimes catch someone staring and wonder if they recognized me from the news or if they were one of Grace's supporters. The nightmares faded but never fully went away, and I still double-checked my locks and saved screenshots of any weird messages just in case. 5 months after the trial, I sat in the courtroom again for Grace's sentencing, watching her stand in front of the judge in a conservative suit instead of her usual designer clothes. The judge gave her 2 years probation and 500 hours of community service at the Children's Hospital, plus mandatory therapy and anger management classes. She also had to pay all my legal fees and the wages I'd lost from the families who'd fired me, which her lawyer said would come to almost $40,000. Grace read a statement acknowledging that her pride and prejudice had endangered a child's life, that she'd let her ego matter more than Sophia's safety, that she'd tried to destroy someone whose only crime was being young and looking different while doing their job. The next day, Angela called to invite me to something special, a first aid training day she'd organized for parents at the community center, and she wanted me to be the instructor. 30 families showed up, including some who'd been at that playdate, and we spent 6 hours going over CPR and choking response and basic wound care. I taught them on special mannequins designed for practice, showing them how to position their hands and how much pressure to use, and Sophia bounced around the room telling everyone how I'd saved her life and showing off the junior EMT badge I'd given her. One of the moms who'd laughed at me that day came up afterward and apologized, saying she'd been wrong to judge me by my age and appearance, that she'd signed up for a full first aid course because she never wanted to be that useless in an emergency again. By the end of the class, we'd covered everything from allergic reactions to broken bones, and Angela announced she wanted to make it a monthly event, bringing in different emergency responders to teach parents how to protect their kids when seconds counted. The months that followed became a blur of teaching and healing, with my therapy sessions helping me process everything that had happened. I was sorting through mail one afternoon when I found an envelope with Grace's handwriting, my hands shaking slightly as I opened it during my session. The letter filled 3 pages with her admitting she'd been terrified of losing control and status, that watching me save Sophia had shattered her whole worldview, and she was learning about something called narcissistic injury in her own therapy now. She asked for forgiveness, but I folded the letter and tucked it into my bag, knowing I wasn't ready yet. A week later, the pediatric training center called with a full-time position offer to develop their curriculum, and when I told my babysitting families, they threw me a goodbye party at the park where Jackson clung to my leg and made me promise I'd still come for emergencies. My first major conference had me standing in front of 200 childcare providers, my hands steady as I clicked through slides showing the grape incident and proper response techniques. The room erupted when I finished, with dozens of people sharing their own stories of being dismissed and underestimated, and we ended up forming an informal support network right there. Angela texted me a video of Sophia's kindergarten show and tell, where she demonstrated the child-safe choking sign to her whole class, proudly telling everyone about her hero Emma, while her teacher took notes to implement it school-wide. I was reviewing training materials when a nurse I knew from the hospital mentioned she'd seen Grace volunteering in the children's ward, reading stories and actually engaging with the kids like she meant it. My lawyer called to say the defamation countersuit had settled, with Grace's insurance paying damages that I immediately donated to create EMT training scholarships, the first one going to a young woman covered in tattoos who'd been told she didn't look professional enough for healthcare. Mrs. Miller asked me to babysit one special evening so she could attend a promotion ceremony. She said she never would have pursued without seeing my strength through everything. And Jackson, now 5, spent the whole night calling me his superhero and showing me his drawings of me saving people. I was grabbing milk at the grocery store when I literally bumped into one of the original Playdate moms, who apologized over and over, admitting she'd been completely wrong and her daughter was actually signed up for my first aid class next week. Teaching my evening class, I noticed a familiar figure in the back row, Grace sitting quietly beside a friend who was fostering children, taking careful notes without making eye contact until after class, when she thanked me briefly for the lesson before leaving. The training center had become my second home by the time Angela brought Sophia to visit, watching her proudly show off her junior first responder certificate from my kids program, demonstrating proper hand positions and emergency procedures with the confidence of someone who'd truly learned. As they headed for the door, Sophia turned back and said, "Thank you for saving me so I could save others too," her words hitting me like a physical force as I watched them walk away, realizing that terrifying moment in Grace's living room had led me exactly where I needed to be, teaching hundreds of people the skills that could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph, between a child lost and a life saved. Thanks for sticking with me through all my questions and wonderings today. It's been a genuinely interesting ride exploring it all with you. Until we meet again, Stay curious. Like the video. It helps more than you think.